Are you the kind of person that has a particular affection for expensive exotic cars, but also suffers from the affliction of being broke? Then this is the video for you, because I put together a list of cheap exotic cars that might be a little bit more attainable within your lifetime. Well, $70,000 isn't cheap. Look, they're high-end exotic cars, so you're not gonna find a $20,000 Ferrari. Go ahead and get that idea out of your head right now. You might find a $20,000 Maserati, and whether you want a $20,000 Maserati is another question, and we're gonna get into that. Because certain cars have seen so much depreciation that if you do your research on maintenance and current market values, you'll find that some of your childhood dream cars might actually be within reach without trapping or scamming or buying a course from a scammer who says he can turn you into a millionaire overnight. But since you, just like me, want an exotic car before our hair turns white, stay tuned so you can be aware of some of the most insane deals on the secondhand market, and I saved the most reliable one for last, so make sure you watch until the end.
Hi guys, I'm Shmi and you're watching Vinstagram.
And actually, let's start off with cars that you can't get for cheap, because they're so good, people know they're so good, and they were priced correctly from factory, and so the market just reflects that. You're not gonna get a 911 GT3 for cheap. You still basically have to be a millionaire to get a GT3. People are probably gonna jump in the comments and be like, well, what about this one? There might be that one car that's like the cheapest listing in the country because it's been used and abused on the track by like 5 different owners, but for the most part, a GT3 is still gonna cost you. They hold value well. Even a 996 GT3 is going for over 100K. A 991 GT3 is going for over 100K. And you might think that 100K isn't expensive for an exotic, but a 991 GT3 started at, I believe, 140,000. And even with inflation, that's not an entire ton more. You also won't find any mid-engine Ferraris or Lamborghinis of the past 10 years for very cheap. And the same goes for front-engine V12s of the past 10 years, especially since they don't make mid-engine V8 Ferraris or V10 Lambos anymore, and the new V12s are like $500,000 or more. Now let's get into the cheap stuff, starting off with something that I personally want to look into in the next 5 to 7 years. You can probably make any generation of Vantage fit your price range right now, and that's common knowledge, but I'm specifically talking about the one that's currently for sale with the AMG V8. While you can't quite get the new facelift car for cheap yet, it'll probably happen. Just give it 4 to 5 more years. But the pre-facelift cars, which you used to see with an MSRP of like $150,000 and realistically list at around $200K with options, can regularly be found in the $80,000 range, the $70,000 range, even the $60,000 range. And it's not like they're running a V8 of extremely questionable reliability. This uses the same motor that the C63, the E63, the G63, S63, SL63, etc. have used for around a decade with varying use cases and mileage. So the knowledge is out there. You don't have to go to some niche Aston Forum or some crazy high-end mechanic. You can just go to the Mercedes dealership. And these cars look barely different from the new facelift, so I think over the years they're gonna age pretty well. It has a pretty potent engine that can be kind of pricey to tune, but can hold its own against supercars. It has an extremely luxurious interior. You're not gonna see a bunch of black plastic and other BS pseudo luxury materials like you're gonna see in a Mercedes. And this can honestly be said across Aston Martin's entire lineup. For some reason, nobody wants to buy Astons right now, despite being incredibly cool. And you can find some insane discounts on new DBXs, and you can find them below 100K all day on the used market. And if you want an older DBS, you can get into a not new, but not entirely old, and still very good looking and great sounding V12 Aston for under 100K all day. Now I know I said you can't get a GT3 for cheap, but if you really want a 911 for the price of a new Tahoe, that's not an unrealistic expectation. I'm not particularly talking about a 997 or earlier here, because I feel like as 911s age, they start to lose that exotic factor unless it's one of the cooler trims that you're still spending over $100,000 on. Ed Bolian once said something along the lines of, the best cheap Porsche is the cheapest 911 you can find. I'm gonna slightly modify that. I've driven just about every single trim of 991, 911 besides the 911R, the GT3 RS, and the GT2 RS. With that being said though, I think the Carrera S or a Carrera T are the most fun you can have per dollar in a 911 for less than $100,000. And actually you might be able to find a turbo with a few owners and a lot of miles for less than 100K, but you're gonna be really pushing it. Like after closing fees, taxes, registration, etc., you'll probably still be over 100K. And that's kind of the hard line I'm drawing in this video for what's realistically attainable, if you will. But yeah, you can find a 991 Carrera S or Carrera T anywhere from the $60,000 range all the way up to 100K, honestly, depending on if you want a .1 or a .2, the options, how clean of a car you're looking for. But 911 Carreras in general are some of the most reliable high-end vehicles out there. In general, they're better taken care of than their Mercedes and BMW counterparts, and tend to have lower maintenance costs as well. So even if you end up spending more on the purchase price than an equivalent Mercedes or BMW, you're not gonna lose your ass on depreciation or come out of a stupid amount of money because of some random expense you'd expect from an oldish Mercedes. I have a friend who I used to work at a Porsche dealership with who is addicted to buying the most expensive cars for the lowest price possible. He recently got a 2019 Cayenne for cheaper than my mom just bought a 4Runner. It has 100,000 miles, but it's a a sub 30K Cayenne. Back when we were working together at the Porsche dealership, he had a Maserati Quattroporte that he picked up for less than a brand new BRZ with no option. I don't know if I said Aston Martin were the kings of depreciation, but if I did, I lied. Maserati has always been the king of depreciation, and as long as they keep overpricing their cars, they will continue to be the kings of depreciation. Throughout the 2000s and early 2010s, they had some very questionable interiors with dated technology they wouldn't update far past when they should have. Their entire identity was, "But my Ferrari engine," and the owners would go out of their way just to let you know that was the only cool thing their car had going on. In the mid 2010s, their interiors did get a refresh, but only to make them look like slightly nicer Dodges. And none of this would really be an issue if the new car prices were just more realistic. I've driven a few Maseratis, one of them being the most potent Ghibli before you start stepping into Trofeo territory, and honestly, the engine sounded pretty cool, and the throttle response feels and sounds like how a Ferrari does. I also drove a pretty nice spec facelift Gran Turismo, and I won't lie, that is easily top 3 best sounding cross-plane V8s I've ever had the pleasure of experiencing. And for the record, it's not completely a Ferrari motor. It's built on a Ferrari block from the F430 with entirely different internals, hence the entirely different sound. That being said, these cars costed 120 grand brand new with no option. Later, the price went up to like 150K, and realistically, the options on these cars were very pricey, so it wouldn't be unusual to see cars listing for over $200,000. You'll even see that today on the new V6 models. I think the 2019 model I drove was originally around $200,000, and by the time I got my hands on it, it was only slightly used and was listed embarrassingly close to $100,000 just in 2021. Honestly, the driving experience was very cool, very fun, but in my opinion, worth even less than $100,000, and the market certainly reflects that. Even when you look at the new MC20, they depreciate hard. I'd say an accurate fair price for a new Maserati Gran Turismo should be starting at maybe slightly more than an M4. And see, the market knew this already, which is why you can always find a used Gran Turismo for the same sort of money as you would find a used M4. Honestly, I would more closely compare this car to an E92 M3 though, because it's that slow, it sounds that good, and it looks even better. Alright, so I know y'all probably want to see some real exotics on this list at some point, so I won't hold out on y'all any longer. Let's get into the Lamborghinis and Ferraris. Like I said in the beginning, you can find a Maserati in the 20s if you really want to, even a Gran Turismo, but you're not going to get into the kind of Ferrari that you really want for under $50,000. What you can find though, and y'all need to stop sleeping on these cars, is a Ferrari California. Cause hear me out for a sec. For 60 to 70K, you can have a dark horse Mustang, or you can have a Ferrari. You can have a BMW M2, or you can have a Ferrari. You can have an M340i, or you can have a Ferrari. You can have a Mercedes C43, or you can have a damn Ferrari. You can have a C8 Vet. Okay, I'm probably going to take the C8 Vet over a Ferrari California. I'm not going to hold you. But the Ferrari California at the end of the day is still a Ferrari. You get the same engine as in the F430, but fun fact, the California is the only car this engine ever came in where it was mated to a dual clutch transmission instead of that clunky automated manual that plagued every exotic car of the 2000s. It still sounds exactly like you would expect a Ferrari to sound. And my least favorite thing about the Roma was that it got that soft top, whereas the California was a hard top convertible, so if it rains, your car still looks good with the top up. This kind of package can again be had anywhere from the mid 60s really all the way into the late 80s. Unless you're dead set on having a pristine Ferrari California, I'd honestly rather have a nicer Vantage past that price point. I feel like at this point, California hate is so forced. Back in the day, people used to act like it was the Ferrari you buy your wife because it was easier to drive, like it was a poor man's Ferrari, even though it was never cheap until the Ferrari California T came out. But at the end of the day, you would have been spending slightly more than a fully optioned Gran Turismo for a real Ferrari. That being said, if you don't want to buy a girl car, you can get a Ferrari 360 for not much more. You're gonna get an older, more archaic Ferrari, which nonetheless people still love, arguably more than a California. It's gonna be more hardcore, certainly less practical because you're sitting lower with a mid-engine layout, less trunk space. You're also much more likely to find a manual 360 within your price range because manual Californias are borderline non-existent. Like, good luck finding one in the first place. If you're watching this video, you probably didn't even realize manual Californias existed at all, but you can find decent 360s starting in the same price range as the California. The mean price in the lower quartile are probably a little bit higher though. If you want a Ferrari but you can really only afford a Mustang GT, you can get a Mundial, which a lot of owners say is still a really fun car. What you're still gonna get is a gated manual shifter with the mid-engine flat plane V8 Ferrari driving experience. It's just that most people can't tell that it's an actual Ferrari. It just doesn't have the same curb appeal, and if you're watching this video looking for serious advice on how to get into an exotic car for the lowest price possible, that presence probably matters to you at least a little bit. It's okay, you can admit it, like you're human, therefore you are at least a little bit vain. If you want a Lamborghini for under 100K, your only real option is a pre-LP 5.0 Gallardo made from 2003 to 2007. Later on, it got the much more reliable 5.2 liter V10 that we know and love from the Huracan, but these cars didn't have that, which is why if you're gonna look into these, you really need to do your research on maintenance costs, reliability, reliability, and where you can find mechanics that actually like to work on these. These cars on the low end are already pushing up into the 80 and 90K range, and from what I hear, the reliability is questionable at best. This was one of the last Lambo engines before Audi became involved in everything. That being said, this motor sounds so good. The tone that comes from this car is something that you're gonna be really hard pressed to replicate with the 5.2 liter V10. It's funny because there's so many exhaust systems for the 5.2 liter cars that claim to have an F1 sound, but they end up all just sounding like a 5.2 car, just louder. So the only setup that sounds as good as the 5.0 Gallardos is this new secret weapon fab exhaust. They did this crazy like equal length 180-degree titanium header setup, but it costs like $20,000, and I think it's in such a weird shape that you have to take the motor out to install it, just to sound nearly as good as the even firing 5.0 Gallardos that you can find for under $100,000. So when you realize you can't afford a 5.2 Gallardo, nor can you afford $20,000 headers, and you buy an early Gallardo, just be aware of what it takes to maintain these. Unpopular opinion, but I like how these look so much more than the LP Gallardo. And it's more so a nostalgia thing than it is the pre-LP Gallardos looking fundamentally more attractive, because if you want that 2000s aesthetic, the 5.0 Gallardos are it. I used to disagree with this until I turned like 20, and I thought that if I ever bought a 5.0 Gallardo because I want the exhaust note, that I'd convert the exterior to a new one. But in retrospect, a lot of attempts at a conversion kind of suck. You get a lot of guys who will replace the taillights, which are already expensive, and they'll replace the deck lid because you have to replace the deck lid when you get new taillights, but they don't replace the lower bumper and exhaust to match the aesthetic. Or you'll get guys who replace the front bumper but don't replace the headlights because the headlights are ungodly expensive, and would mean you have to replace the hood, which also would mean you have to replace the front trunk lining and everything in there, because realistically with how much the lights cost and with everything else you'd have to replace to go for a full conversion, you probably have at least $20,000 into such a build. And at that point, if you want the look so bad, just get a newer Gallardo. The 2008 and later Gallardos had a more modern look that ultimately aged better and were designed more for the 2010s. You could see how the modern exterior lighting was more synonymous with the Aventador that sold alongside it for a brief period, and if I'm being real, I still like that version of the Gallardo better than the Huracan. The way that y'all don't like the Temerario's aesthetics is the way that I didn't like the Huracan. If you wanted a cheaper car with a Ferrari motor, you could get a Maserati Gran Turismo. If you want the Maserati Gran Turismo of Lamborghinis, you could always get the Audi R8, and that came with a real Lamborghini motor and a real Lamborghini chassis. Not a motor that was built by Lamborghini on a Lamborghini block, but with new internals that was put in a car that was nothing like a Lamborghini. The Audi R8 is the more affordable Gallardo, and for less than $100,000, you can get it with the more reliable 5.2 liter V10. Granted, for under $100,000, you're probably not going to find it with the more modern S-tronic dual clutch gearbox that is more synonymous with the Huracan. Those are the facelifted 2013 and later models. So with the 2012 and earlier models, you'll get that R-tronic gearbox, which is essentially the same E-gear transmission, the single clutch semi-auto that you'll find in the Gallardos, the Aventadors, the Murciélagos, something like that. Which if you like it, you like it. There are people that can't stop banging on about those, but it kind of sucks because it's basically the manual transmission with an automatic shifting mechanism on top of it. But that shifting mechanism acts like a 16-year-old who just got his license, just learned manual, and has taken his parents' manual transmission car for a joyride for the first time. If you can get over that though, the original R8 V10 is a great time. You can get it as the iconic Iron Man coupe or the convertible, which if you watch one of Shmee's recent videos, you'll realize I started watching him because of that car. You can find cleaner examples of these for cheaper than a Gallardo with a more reliable engine than the Gallardo that you can find in this sort of price range. And if you can't even afford that, I feel you. This is where the R8 V8 comes into play. You know, I always wish they made a new R8 V8 with the new facelift and the new twin turbo V8 that they put in all their new RS cars, but I knew that would never actually happen because you would get more torque in the bottom end, more horsepower per dollar, and more performance mod for mod, tune for tune than the more expensive Huracan, up to maybe like 900 horsepower when putting a VF supercharger or a lower end turbo kit on the V10 will cost you roughly the same as modifying the twin turbo V8 to that same level. But going FBO with the tune on an R8 V10 is not going to get you to 800 horsepower like it will with the twin turbo V8 in like an RS7 or a Urus or something. It sucks that motor never saw use in an R8 V8, but the R8 V8 you can buy can be had for even cheaper than the R8 V10, and that motor is basically the V10 with 2 cylinders cut off, similar to how the S65 and the E9X M3 is the S85 from the M5 with 2 cylinders missing. And like the S65, the V8 and the R8 V8 sounds amazing and revs to the moon. It only makes 420 horsepower, which I guess is kind of slow for something that's supercar adjacent, but this is one of the more exotic feeling and exotic sounding crossplane V8s out there. Certainly up there with the M3 and the Gran Turismo. What it loses in power, it gains in emotion. Not to mention that besides having a V8 badge and quad exhaust tips, it looks exactly the same as the V10, and I really don't think anyone looking for an entry-level exotic car will be disappointed with how this car sounds, especially when you can get it for cheaper than a new G80 M3 competition. And since these are considerably cheaper than the R8 V10, you can regularly come across those 2013 to 2015 listings with the S-tronic dual clutch gearbox in that 60 to 80k range. The technology in the interior feels a bit dated, especially compared to the new R8, but if you were ever considering a Gallardo and thought this was the more cost-effective option, you're not really missing anything. Now, at the beginning of the video, I told you I was going to save the most reliable option for last, and I plan on keeping that promise. So without further ado, we have the Lotus Elise and other Lotus products that I plan on getting into. Now, in the 90s and earlier, Lotus did not have the best reputation for reliability. They had some cool engines like the flat plane V8 and the Esprit, but like my dad and my late Uncle Mike pointed out, so in the meantime, Lotus started selling the Elise. It was a tiny bare-bones sports car with exotic aesthetics, golf cart-like handling characteristics, and a power plant from one of the most reliable engine platforms of all time. This was a Toyota 2ZZ-GE that also saw use in the Corolla and Celica, so if it's up to snuff for Toyota to use in sporty versions of their bread and butter, then it's up to snuff for me in the Lotus. This also might be the only car on this list that you can definitely find for below $50,000. Sometimes one might pop up in the 30s, but they aren't as common as they were before 2020. These days you can find one in the mid 40s for sure. Really clean ones can be found in the 50s and 60s, but even the most expensive one I could find on Auto Trader was at like $74,000. That's still cheaper than probably the cheapest listing you can find on a 5.0 Gallardo right now. If I want a sports car that can actually handle, and I mean like actually handle, I cannot fathom buying an American muscle car over a Lotus in this price range. Yes, you can find an S550 Mustang and it'll be nicer, it'll be more comfortable, cause yeah, the Elise is a really raw car. The interior is nothing special, you're gonna be touching shoulders with your passenger, and it really is just a road legal go-kart with like 200 horsepower, and with fluids I think it weighs just over 2,000 pounds. If you want something a little bit more comfortable, a little bit more spacious, we might as well get into the Evora as well. This was basically a Lotus Elise, built on the same platform, but slightly bigger, and this time with a Toyota V6. And if you wanted a Lotus that was actually fast, you could get it with a supercharger as the Evora S. Now this was significantly bigger and heavier, but it still weighed just over 3,000 pounds, and this is still light by today's supercar standards, because nowadays we got fat V12s with hybrid assistance weighing down on cars pushing over 4,000 pounds, whereas Lotus never lost their philosophy, because even in modern day, the new Emira with the supercharged Toyota V6 only weighs slightly more than the Evora at 3,200 pounds. Now there aren't many Emiras on the market, but of what I could find, you could get used ones in the $70,000 and $80,000 range, which for a new car that costed over 100K a couple thousand miles ago isn't terrible. But if you look at the $40,000 and $50,000 Evora and Elise examples I was talking about, you're potentially looking at 20-year-old cars. The depreciation curve is fairly broad, so a Lotus, even as new as the Emira, isn't really a bad buy. They certainly perform better on the used market than damn near every car we mentioned here before, and that's considering we spoke on R8s, which do decently well, 991, 911s that are 10 years old and you still can't get most of the high-end desirable trims for under 100K. And even though there are Lotus Elise listings in the 30s, you have to consider that these were like 39K brand new, so even adjusted for inflation, that isn't terrible depreciation in the slightest.